There's a road in northern Montana that stops being a road about 4 miles before you expect it to. It doesn't announce this. There's no sign, no barrier. The gravel just gets thinner, the ruts get deeper, and then one day, usually right when your gas gauge has dipped into the yellow and your phone has gone to 1 bar and then none, the road simply gives up on you. Like it was testing you the whole time, like it wanted to see if you turn back. Most people do. She didn't. The first time Nora Vasquez drove that road, it was March, and the snowpack was still 3 feet deep in the shadows. She was 39 years old, 12 pounds lighter than she'd been at 34, and carrying a paper folder with a property deed inside it, the way most people carry things they're afraid to believe in close to the chest, not quite touching her heart. She'd been looking for 2 years. Not for land exactly, for quiet that had teeth. There's a difference. Quiet you can find in a library, in a church, in the medication the VA prescribes when your hands won't stop running through the same 3 seconds on repeat. That kind of quiet is borrowed. It belongs to someone else. You hand it back at the door. What she wanted was quiet that would fight back if you disturbed it. Quiet with consequence. The mountain had 1,400 acres of it. The listing had called it a remote recreational property with significant development potential. The previous owner, a retired civil engineer from Billings named Harold Petch, had bought it in 1997 with the idea of building a hunting lodge. He'd managed to pour a foundation and frame 2 walls before his back gave out, and his ambitions reorganized themselves around a single-story house closer to a pharmacy. He'd held the land for 26 years, with the particular stubbornness of a man who didn't want to admit the mountain had beaten him. He sold it to Nora for $340,000. She paid in cash. She'd saved money the way soldiers save things, without thinking about it, because the habit had more survival instinct than the person. 12 years of base pay and deployment bonuses, and nothing to spend money on in the places they'd sent her. Afghanistan once, Iraq twice. A third location she still referred to as that place even in her own head, because numbing it felt like giving it more real estate than it deserved. She'd been a designated marksman, later a sniper, later still an instructor. What she'd been when she signed her separation papers at 36 was a woman who'd been looking through a scope for so long that everything at close range felt slightly blurry and slightly threatening. The cabin she built took 18 months. Not because she hired slowly, because she did most of it herself, and because she went deliberately the way she did everything now. Measure twice, breathe, cut once. She'd learned carpentry from YouTube videos and a dog-eared copy of a Taunton press book she'd ordered off the internet. And she made mistakes the way anyone does when they're building something real. The east wall was slightly out of plumb. The loft stairs were steeper than she'd intended. The kitchen window faced north instead of east because she'd read the elevation map wrong, and the sun didn't come where she expected it to. She kept all the mistakes. The out-of-plumb wall, the steep stairs, the north-facing window that gave her gray light in the mornings instead of gold. She kept them because fixing them would have meant pretending she hadn't made them, and she was done with that particular practice. The cabin sat at 6,200 feet, tucked against a granite ridge that caught snow from the north and broke the worst of the wind. There was a creek. She called it just the creek because numbing things felt like making promises that ran clean and cold enough to pull her hand back in a sharp breath even in August. There were elk. There were mule deer. There were mountain lions moving through twice a year in patterns. She'd started to map the second spring, tracking their scat and their prints with the same methodical patience she'd once applied to very different targets. There were no neighbors for 11 miles. This was not a problem. The closest town, a place called Ridgemont with a population of 840 and a gas station that doubled as a post office, knew who she was the way small towns always know things, incompletely, inaccurately, and with tremendous confidence. That woman up on the Petch land keeps to herself. Military, I think, or maybe government, or maybe both. She went to Ridgemont twice a month. Groceries, propane, the occasional hardware item. She spoke to people the way she'd learned to speak in places where language was a liability, in complete sentences, without filler, without apology. People found this either impressive or unsettling, depending on what they needed from other people. She didn't particularly need anything from other people. This was not coldness. It was just the shape her life had taken, the way a creek takes the shape of what's in front of it. She discovered the poaching in her second autumn on the mountain. First, the signs. A gut pile left in a meadow 2 miles from her cabin, the entrails of a bull elk, frozen in the early October cold, the cut marks on the hide wrong in the particular way that means a machine saw rather than a knife. Clean, too clean, the kind of clean that comes from a commercial processor rather than a hunter who field-dressed his own animal. Then a snare line, 6-wire snares set in a draw where mule deer funneled through between a water source and a bedding area. Not Montana hunting season, not a hunting license configuration she'd recognize. Then a truck. She heard it before she saw it, a diesel engine running rough, the way trucks run when someone's hauling more weight than the vehicle was built for. She was 2 ridges away when she heard it, moving back from her morning water quality check on the creek. She didn't hurry. She never hurried. Hurrying was for people who hadn't yet learned that speed and haste are different things, that speed is controlled and haste is just fear in motion. She climbed the closer ridge, settled in behind a cluster of Douglas firs, and glassed the valley below with her binoculars. 2 men, 1 truck, an F-250, black Montana plates, the bed covered with a blue tarp that was weighted wrong to be empty. They were working a second snare line in the bottom of the draw, checking traps, resetting traps, moving with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this before and expected to keep doing it. She watched for 45 minutes. She counted the animals they'd taken, or rather, she counted what she could estimate from the weight of what they loaded under the tarp, from the shapes she could read against the fabric. 3, maybe 4 deer. One that moved wrong, that got loaded still alive, its legs cycling weakly against the plastic. She noted the plate number. She came back down the ridge the same way she'd gone up, slowly, placing her feet deliberately on loose ground, making no sound that the mountain hadn't already agreed to absorb. She reported it to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks the next morning. This was not because she was naive. She knew exactly how understaffed FWP was, exactly how many thousands of acres fell under each warden's patrol, exactly what percentage of reported poaching incidents resulted in prosecution. She'd done the math on her second week on the mountain, the same way she did the math on everything, without sentiment, without the wish that the numbers would come out differently. She reported it because it was the correct first step. And she waited. The FWP warden who called her back was named Dale Acaffer. He was 44, 15 years on the job, a man whose voice had the particular texture of someone who'd been delivering bad news professionally long enough to have made peace with it. He knew the plates, he told her. He'd had reports on those plates before. The men connected to the truck. He didn't give her names, though she noted he had them ready, which meant he'd looked them up before calling, were part of an operation that had been active in 3 counties. They sold to a buyer in Missoula who moved wildlife through channels that were expensive and invisible, and very much outside everything the law could currently touch without a longer investigation than anyone had staffed or funded. So they'll be back, Nora said. It was not a question. I'd expect so, Dale said. Ms. Vasquez, I want you to understand these aren't weekend hunters pushing the season. These are people who are doing this professionally. I'd encourage you to. I understand, she said. She did. She'd spent 12 years in places where the infrastructure of consequence was either absent or deliberately broken, where the formal systems that were supposed to deter bad behavior had been corroded past usefulness. She understood, at a cellular level, What happened in that vacuum? She thanked Dale Akafer. She meant it. She ended the call. Then she sat on the porch of her cabin and looked at the mountain, the specific angle of afternoon light on the granite ridge, the way the shadows collected in the draw where she'd watched the two men work their snare line, the elk trails she'd spent 2 years learning like a second language. Her mountain. She'd bought it with money that cost things she didn't talk about. She'd built a life on it with her own hands, with mistakes she'd kept because they were honest. She'd mapped its water and its wildlife and its weather with a patience that most people would call obsessive, and that she called simply the correct way to know a place. These men were coming back. They were going to come back onto her mountain, into the draws she'd mapped, and the meadows she'd named in her head and never out loud, and they were going to take animals from it with machines and wire, and no more consideration than a person scrapes mud off a boot. She went inside. She made tea. She thought for a long time, the way she thought, without urgency, without noise, with everything unnecessary stripped away until only the actual problem remained. The actual problem was not the poachers. The poachers were an effect. The cause was simpler. They did not believe there was anyone on this mountain who could make them stop. She understood the solution to that. The mountain was watching. That was the thing about 1,400 acres. The mountain could watch everything and wait. It had been doing exactly that for longer than anyone who'd ever walked across it could properly imagine. Nora had learned to borrow that patience the way she borrowed the quiet. Not ownership, temporary custody. She set up her first camera that weekend. Not trail cameras, though she had those too, had placed them on every major game trail in her first 6 months, had a map on her wall that was color-coded by species density and temporal pattern, and which most people who saw it assumed was something classified. These were different. Small, weather-resistant, positioned not on game trails, but on the 2 most logical entry points for a truck carrying the weight she'd estimated under that tarp. She put one in a spruce knot at the first cattle guard. She put one in a rock formation above the second road fork. Then she went back to her life. She repaired a section of the cabin roof that had been worrying her since July. She cut and stacked 6 cords of wood. She mapped the mountain lion corridor she'd been tracking since spring, following prints through 2 feet of early November snow with the same focused attention she gave everything, which was total. She waited. The mountain waited with her. On the 17th day, the cameras woke up. The cameras sent motion alerts to her phone at 4:47 in the morning. She was already awake. She'd been sleeping in 4-hour blocks since Afghanistan, a habit the VA sleep specialist called fragmented sleep architecture, and that she called how she slept now, and it was the second block, the one between 3 and 5 that usually ran short. She was reading a water management manual, dense and specific, the kind of book that required attention and gave it back as something useful, when the phone buzzed on the wooden crate she used as a nightstand. She looked at the footage. The F-250 again, same truck, same plates. 3 men this time. She noted the upgrade. 1 additional person meant either they'd found this territory profitable enough to expand resources, or the operation was moving faster than before. Either interpretation pointed the same direction. She dressed without turning on the main light. She didn't need it. She knew the cabin the way she'd learned to know structures in the field by negative space, by the feel of the floor under her feet, by the particular creak 3 steps from the door that she'd never fixed because it was useful. She put on base layers, wool mid-layer, the outer shell she'd bought for this specific elevation and this specific wind pattern. She laced her boots in the dark. She took her rifle from the safe, a Tikka T3X in .308, nothing exotic, well-maintained, which is to say she could field strip and reassemble it without looking, and had done so recently to confirm she still could. She did not carry the rifle the way people who are planning to use a rifle carry a rifle. She carried it the way a carpenter carries a hammer, as a tool that belonged in her hand the same way her hand belonged at the end of her arm, completely, without drama. She went out into the dark. November at 6,200 feet is a specific kind of cold. It doesn't come at you, it just occupies everything, fills in every space where warmth might have been, patient and total. Nora had made peace with this cold in her first winter. She'd gone out in it deliberately in the first weeks, before she had the cabin fully weatherized. Standing in it the way you stand in something you intend to understand, not to conquer it, just to learn its grammar. Now she moved through it like a word in its own sentence. The draw where the snare lines had been set was 2 miles from the cabin, 2 miles of terrain she knew precisely. The pitch of the ground, the loose rock above the second bench, the way the creek bent left before the wide meadow and created a natural funnel where deer moved at dawn. She moved without a headlamp. The sky was clear, the moon 3/4 full, the snow on the ground giving back enough light to navigate by if you knew where you were going. She knew where she was going. She was moving parallel to the route she expected the men to take, one ridge over, maintaining a position that kept her elevated and downwind. She wasn't closing on them. Not yet. She was orienting, the first thing before everything else, the thing you do before any decision, because a decision made without orientation is just a reaction wearing a decision's clothes. She stopped on the second bench and listened. Voices. The particular quality of voices in cold open air, thin, carrying farther than the speakers knew. 2 of the 3 men were talking. She couldn't make out words, but she could make out register, one voice lower and instructional, one voice higher and slightly anxious, which meant at least one of them had a doubt about something. The third man wasn't speaking. She picked out their lamp beams through the trees. 3 points of light moving in a loose V, the 2 outer ones working the tree line, the center one moving down the draw floor toward the water. They'd split the work. Efficient. They'd done this before and they'd learned the terrain either from previous visits or from map study, and the intelligence of the operation made it more offensive, not less, because it meant they weren't desperate and they weren't stupid. They were here because they'd calculated the risk and found it acceptable. She was about to change that calculation. She came around the base of the ridge and entered the draw from the upstream end, putting herself between the creek and the upper tree line, and she sat down in the snow behind a deadfall that was chest-high and had been there long enough to be structural, to be part of the landscape rather than on top of it. She settled into it the way she settled into a hide, without fidgeting, without adjusting, finding the position that she could hold for however long this took. The center lamp beam was 50 yards away and closing. She waited until the man with the center lamp came within 30 yards of her position. She turned on her own headlamp. The man stopped like she'd nailed his feet to the ground. He was mid-30s, heavy jacket, a bolt cutter in one hand and a canvas bag in the other that was moving in a way that suggested live animals. She looked at the bag. Something in her face must have done something when she looked at the bag, because he took a half step backward before she'd said a single word. "Set the bag down," she said. Her voice at 30 yards in the cold dark was exactly what she'd learned to make it in rooms where you didn't get to say things twice. Not loud, not hard, just final. The kind of voice that belongs to people who have stood in the specific silence that follows a trigger pull and understand, at a level beyond training, what it means to be the last sound something hears. The man set the bag down. "Where are your partners?" she said. Not a question, an accounting. He looked left. The left lamp beam had stopped moving. She could see it through the trees, stationary, which meant the man holding it had heard her voice and made the correct decision to stop and assess. The right lamp beam was still moving, which meant the third man either hadn't heard her or had decided hearing her was optional. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and produced a whistle, sharp, directional, the kind that doesn't echo but arrives at its target like a pointed finger. The right lamp beam stopped. "Come to the creek," she said at a volume that reached both of them. "Both of you now." There was a pause, the specific pause of men recalculating odds. Then both beams started moving toward her. The second man came out of the trees carrying a rifle, a scope .270 on a sling not raised but present. Making a point, she thought, or trying to. He was the taller of the two, mid-40s, a beard going gray at the jaw, and he had the particular posture of a man who'd spent his life being the largest person in the room and had made decisions based on this. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was holding her tikka at low ready, muzzle down at 45 degrees, her right hand on the grip without tension, and she was standing in the snow at 6,200 feet in the dark, with the particular stillness of someone who has been trained to be more dangerous at rest than most people are in motion. He registered this. She watched him register it, watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the shift from largest person in the room to woman alone in the dark with a rifle, which was a different equation, and the right edge of his mouth moved in a way that might have been meant as a smile. "You're on private land," she said. "Posted land. You've been here before. I have it on camera, both visits, including the F-250 plates, which FWP already has in a file with your names on it." She didn't know their names. She said it anyway. "Now you've got a rifle out on my land at 5 in the morning," she continued. "I want you to think carefully about the next thing you do." The third man was younger, 20-something, the anxious voice, and up close he had the look of someone who'd followed older men into situations that had grown larger than he'd signed up for. He was standing slightly behind and to the left of the tall man, and he wasn't looking at Nora. He was looking at the bag on the ground. The bag was still moving. "That's somebody's deer in there," she said. The young one looked up at her. Something in his face, not guilt exactly, because guilt implies you believed you were wrong at the start. Something more like a door opening, a small one. The tall man hadn't moved. He was doing the calculation still, she could tell, running the numbers on a situation that wasn't going the way situations usually went for him. She gave him time. Rushing someone's calculation is how you get bad arithmetic. "Here's what happens next," she said. "You open that bag. You let whatever's alive in it go. You load whatever's under that tarp back onto your truck. You drive it down to the FWP station in Ridgemont, and you tell Dale Ockhafer that it's voluntary surrender, which is going to matter more than you think when this gets to a prosecutor." The tall man laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh that's meant to tell you the person laughing isn't afraid of you. She'd been laughed at before. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in that place, by men with more firepower and more certainty. She had found over time that laughter was the thing people did when they'd run out of other ways to feel superior. It was a last resort. She wasn't offended by it. "Lady," the tall man said. She watched him. "You want to think real careful about how this plays," he said. "This is federal timber land up here. You can't." "I have the deed in my cabin," she said. "Recorded in Flathead County. You're welcome to come look at it." Silence. "You have a rifle on someone's private property at 5 in the morning," she said, "with an illegal snare operation behind you and a vehicle full of poached animals. I've got FWP records, camera footage, and a .308. She let that sit for a moment, just a moment. "I'm the better option in this situation. Dale Ockhafer is the better option. The alternative to us is significantly less comfortable." The young one moved first. He walked to the bag and crouched down and opened the drawstring, and a yearling deer lurched out of it and stood in the snow with its legs shaking, and it looked at nothing and everything at once in the way prey animals look when they're deciding whether the danger is still present, and then it moved into the trees with a gait that was unsteady but alive. The young one watched it go. The door in his face opened a little further. The tall man's name was Reese Calloway. She learned this later from Dale Ockhafer, who called her at 10 that morning with a voice that had shifted its texture, still worn, still professional, but with something underneath it that might have been in a different register, something close to amazed. All three of them came in, Dale said. Voluntary surrender, truck full of animals, 2 elk, 3 deer. They asked to speak to me specifically. Nora was quiet. Calloway told me a woman on the Petch land, your land, had held them at gunpoint. Dale paused. He said she had a tone about her that made him feel like being arrested by me was the preferred outcome. I had a lamp, Nora said, and a rifle at low ready. Nobody was at gunpoint. I know, Dale said, but that's how he described it. She thought about that, about what it meant for a man who'd spent his life being the largest person in rooms to walk into a law enforcement station at 6 in the morning and request to speak to a specific warden. Will it stick? She asked. 3 counts each of unlawful taking, commercial wildlife trafficking, trespassing. With the camera footage and the voluntary surrender, Dale let out a breath. Yeah, it'll stick. She thanked him. She meant it. She hung up and stood at the north-facing window of her kitchen, the one that gave gray light instead of gold, and she looked at the mountain, the ridge still in morning shadow, the draw still holding its cold, the creek line marked by the bare willows that ran silver against the white. The yearling deer was probably 2 miles out by now, moving back into the terrain it knew. She thought about how it had looked when it came out of that bag, the shaking legs, the eyes going in all directions at once, the body's full emergency running through it. And then the decision, and then the tree line. And then gone. She didn't tell anyone what had happened for almost 3 weeks. Not because she was ashamed, not because she was proud, because what had happened was simply a thing that needed doing and then it was done. The way a section of roof that worries you gets repaired, the way 6 cords of wood get stacked, because winter is coming and you live here and this is your life and you take care of what's yours. But word got out anyway. Word always got out in Ridgemont.